welcome back to College Questions. Today we're going to be wrapping up our series on standardized tests with the question, should you submit your SAT or ACT score to all the colleges that you're applying to? Well, right now we live in an environment where test optional admissions are a thing, even though UT Austin, Harvard, and Caltech just announced that they are going to want to see test scores again starting in the fall, and I do anticipate more schools will follow. The vast majority of colleges are allowing you to decide whether or not you want to submit your test scores. As these schools have been test optional, they've benefited in the form of seeing more and more students apply to these colleges, which has dropped their admissions or their acceptance rates significantly. Some of these colleges are also trying to increase their rankings in things like US News and World Report, and SAT score, ACT score, and GPA are some of the largest factors in determining your ranking as a school, because it says something, or they purport that it says something about the quality of student that attends that college. So submitting a higher test score might be a benefit for an admissions officer who was told by their administration that they need to increase the school's ranking in order to make the alumni happy, or whatever it is that they're trying to accomplish, right? So does that mean that if you don't submit a score that you scored poorly? And the answer is not necessarily. The world's more complicated than that. There are lots of reasons for students not to take the SAT, other than, I don't think I'm going to score very well, although that is one of the reasons. You know, depending on where you live, it might be considerably more difficult to get an actual spot in a testing location. If you live in the Bay Area or Los Angeles, maybe even New York City, you might have to drive outside your city and outside of your region to find a seat at an SAT testing location on any given Saturday. I've had several students myself who have driven 2 or 3 hours away from home just to take the test, and the more fortunate families who do that are able to drive out the night before and take a hotel room, but not everyone can do that. A lot of people get up at 5 in the morning and drive out to their testing location to get there before 8 o'clock when they need to check in for the exam. Another possible reason for not taking the test is that maybe your family couldn't afford to get you any support for the test. You couldn't go and get a private tutor or sign up for some sort of class or workshop or anything like that, and so you feel less prepared and less confident in your ability to take the test. Also, on top of that, there is the $55 registration fee that you have to pay for the SAT, for instance. Lastly is the issue of time. If you're going to drive out to a testing location, even if it's nearby, and then take the test, you're giving up half or 2/3 of a Saturday. Well, if you're a student who works and tries to help support the family and, pay maybe the PG&E bill, or these days more likely the water bill, you might not be able to take a Saturday off of work to take the exam. And all of these are valid reasons for not having a test score to submit. And so there might be more than one reason that causes a student to want to submit an application without a test score, other than just not feeling confident in the score that they're submitting. Although many students do worry that that's going to be the assumption that colleges are going to make. So this leads us back to our question. Do you submit your score to every college that you're applying to? Well, there are 2 ways that we can think about this. There's the way that most people are going to think about it, and then there's the way that I encourage my students to think about it. And by the end of this, I think you'll see why the answer to this question is absolutely yes. You're more likely to submit your test scores to every college that you're applying to. So what are these 2 ways of thinking about our test scores? The most common way is going to be looking at the middle 50% for the school and considering whether or not you are going to submit a super score. And before I talk about the logic behind these decisions, I do want to make sure that everyone understands what I mean by middle 50 and what exactly is a super score. So the middle 50% is a statistic that colleges report to the common data set that will tell you approximately how well test takers do who do submit test scores when they apply to the college. This is a more useful metric than just an average. Averages can hide extreme outliers like extremely low scores or extremely high scores, and can make the school look more or less impressive. So what they do is they take all the scores that they receive and they arrange them metaphorically on a number line. And then they find the 25th percentile of scores, and that's the 25. And then they find the 75th percentile of scores, and they report those two percentiles, basically telling you the score range that half of all students were within. So they won't tell you what the highest possible score was that a student submitted, potentially 1600 or 36, depending on the SAT or ACT. And they won't tell you what the lowest possible score was that a student submitted, but they'll tell you sort of where the average is, where the middle 50% of students lie on their test scores. And then a super score is when we submit more than one test score to a college, and then they add up sort of our best math and our best English and produce a score that's higher than our score was on any given test. So, for example, let's say that you took the SAT 3 different times. And on the first test, you got a 680 on English, but a 710 on math. That leaves you with a total of 1390. On your second attempt, you got a 710 on English and a 750 on math. You did better in both instances. Your total score was 1460. And you say, well, I wanted to be above 1500, so I'm going to take it one more time. You get a 750 on English, better again, but you only get a 730 on math. Maybe you focused more on the English because you felt like there was more room to grow there from 710. So you score 1480, which is still better than what you had before, which was 1460. But that means that you have a 750 on your third English attempt, and you have a 750 on your second math attempt. So they can take those two numbers and give you a super score of 1500, which is sort of what you were aiming for. So you won't submit one test, but you would submit multiple tests to the college in order to give them the opportunity to create that higher score. Some colleges will also do this with the ACT, where they will take your different sub-scores and create a super composite score, because the ACT is an average, not a summative total score. But that's a possibility that you can get a super score for your SAT or ACT. So understanding these two things, a lot of people sort of assume that they should look at the middle 50 for every school and use that as a barometer for whether or not they submit, right? If your English score and your math score fall within the middle 50 or in the top 25% of a school's submitted scores, well, then obviously the school's going to be happy with that because it's going to keep their score average the same or raise it a little bit in terms of rankings and that sort of stuff. But also that means that you are at least average or above average for people who apply to the school. And so you might feel like you have a better chance of being admitted. If you happen to be below the middle 50 in one or both categories, that might give you some pause as to whether you're going to submit the score to that school. This leaves you sort of gaming out your decision on every single school you're applying to. Most students apply to somewhere between 9 and 15 schools. I usually recommend my students apply to somewhere in that range, usually about 12. I treat the UCs and the CSUs as one school each, so this adds up to about 7 to 11 applications. So that means that you have to make the decision 7 to 11 times as to whether or not you're submitting. And then you have to go to the college board and submit your scores 7 different times. You need to self-report those scores on the Common App and then unreport those scores when you submit to schools that you're not going to submit the scores to. It becomes a recipe for stress and decision fatigue if we're going to sort of game this out for every single school. It's a really overwhelming process already, and trying to math it out for every single university that you're applying to is just going to make that more onerous and more stressful rather than less. The other way to think about this, and the way that I encourage students to think about submitting scores, is to put the scores into the context of their entire application. So these colleges do usually do what we call holistic review, right? You've probably heard that term or seen that term written on college websites if you're in the middle of researching your schools. A few schools do what we call comprehensive review, which is kind of a synonym for holistic review. It's not exactly, but it's close. Uh, and so what this means is that they're looking at your GPA, they're looking at your test scores if you submit them, they're looking at your extracurricular activities, they're looking at any of your sports teams, they're looking at your personal achievements, like if you win a competition or you create some sort of device or do some sort of personal project. They're looking at your volunteering history, they're looking at your work experience if you have any. They're looking at all these different things. And so notice that your test score is only one of many factors that's being considered in your application. And so when we think about the test score and whether or not we should submit it, we should treat it that way. Treat it as just one factor and ask ourselves the question, does this score make my application stronger or weaker? And then use that to determine whether or not we're going to submit our score. And notice that when we ask ourselves that question, whether or not we submit the score has everything to do with us and our application and nothing to do with which school we're talking about. It's not, does it make my application stronger for Dartmouth or weaker for Dartmouth? It's just, does it make it stronger or weaker, end stop, period, right? And so then we're going to make this decision one time. Well, then how are we going to think about this? How do we determine whether or not it's a good idea to submit? Well, there are two things I want to say about this. One is that your scores can be a way to anchor your GPA or even validate that you are good at particular subjects. So in terms of validation, if you have, a 3.92 unweighted GPA and your weighted GPA is like a 4.4, some colleges like that, but we also acknowledge grade inflation is a thing. And so if you submit a 1480 SAT, that kind of validates that, oh yeah, this student is actually good at the academics. It's not just grade inflation that's helping their GPA. But also let's say that maybe you had a really bad semester and you got a B in Algebra 2, but you've since kind of figured it out, but that B is still weighing down your GPA. Or let's say you had an English teacher that you didn't really vibe with very well. Their teaching style didn't really match how you learn, and it took you a while to figure out the teacher's expectations, and you ended an English class with a B minus. Well, if you submit like a 710 evidence-based reading writing score, that's going to sort of contextualize that B minus a little bit, right? They're going to see the B minus, but then they'll say, yeah, but they scored over 700 on the English section of the SAT. So they kind of do know how English works and how to read and analyze things. So there must be some other reason for that B minus. Or if, we're talking about that B in Algebra 2, but you submit a 750 math score, well, then that B in Algebra 2, yeah, it sucks for your GPA, but you do have the 750 math score, and any questions that arose as a result of that B will be kind of assuaged a little bit in the admission officer's mind when they see that 750. So, and of course, right now I'm using scores above 700, which you would probably want to submit anyway. But even if we're talking about like getting a C in math and then getting a 680 on the math section, you would probably still want to submit that, because even though it's not above 700 and you're not going to be over 1500 on the SAT, showing a 680 on math when you had a C in your math class demonstrates that you do know how to do it and you do have that ability. Maybe something else was going on. Maybe the teacher asked you to do like 100 problems for math homework every single night, but you're also, part of the school musical and you were practicing, you were in rehearsal every single night until 9 p.m. and then you came home, had dinner, did your homework until 1, fell asleep, and you just couldn't do 100 math problems every night. that there are reasons that your grade might be what it is, and it might have nothing to do with your ability. And so the test score is there to kind of validate your ability in light of your GPA. The other thing I wanted to mention is some of the things that we've heard from these colleges like Harvard, Caltech, UT Austin, the things that they've said when they announced that they were going to ask for test scores again anyway for next season. A lot of what they said was that there are students who submitted applications without scores who probably would have got in if they had submitted their scores. And I guess that after these students applied, the colleges went back and did ask these people for their scores. And they kind of said, yeah, if you had submitted a score, then we probably would have admitted you. And these are people often, according to the colleges, these are often, minority students or students from disadvantaged backgrounds or disadvantaged areas who maybe their GPA left some questions, or their grades in certain courses left some questions about their ability to do the work. And even if they got like a 1450 SAT score, which is perfectly serviceable, by the way. I think having a 1450 puts you in the top 7% of all test takers in the United States. So just keep that in mind, that a 1450 is still a really good score in a national context. But had those students submitted that score, they probably would have gotten in. And so even if your score, what these colleges were saying is that even if your score is less than stellar, it might still give them the confidence that they need to feel like you will succeed at their school. In general, erring on the side of more data for these colleges is never going to be a bad thing. Unless the data says something really terrible about you, maybe you got in trouble for something or you got arrested or whatever, but ethically we do need to disclose that. But in general, giving them more information about us is going to help them feel more confident in their ability to say yes to us as applicants. So these are the main reasons that I usually encourage students to submit their scores if they have them. In another video, I talked about imputing, and I'll repeat a little bit of that here. Imputing is when a college looks at your high school's historical data. They're going to look at other applicants from your high school who have applied in the past, and they're going to try to find students who had grades similar to yours or took classes similar to you. Maybe the overall GPA was similar. And they're going to see if those students submitted scores. And if those students submitted scores, they're going to come up with some sort of average score that those students maybe have achieved. And then they're going to say, yeah, we think you would score about that. And they're just going to write that score into your application. So if you don't submit a score, some schools, not all of them, but some of them, are going to make up a number and add that to your application as if you scored that anyway. And usually those numbers are conservative estimates. So maybe you're capable of achieving a 1450, but they might impute a 1400. Well, would you rather they make up 1400 and add that to your application without you knowing? Or would you rather submit a 1430 or 1450? So this is why I encourage you to not spend too much time fretting over the middle 50 or the super score for each and every school that you're looking at, and then trying to game out whether or not you want to apply with a score or without a score. You should think about, what does my score say about me as an applicant? How does it fit into my overall application? Does it make my application stronger, or does it make my application weaker? And if the answer is that it makes my application stronger, then you should submit your score. There will be students for whom it might make the application weaker if they're a poor test taker or something like that. Maybe they have testing anxiety. And then the answer to, do I submit a score, might be no. But in general, I think for a lot of students, the answer is going to be yes. If you're submitting a score, you're going to want to submit that score to every school that you're applying to. If you have any other questions that you want me to answer about college applications or the college application process, You can go ahead and email me at collegequestions@dawesacademics.com, or you can leave a comment below. Thank you.